Thank you all for joining. Super happy to see you all. Just wanted to say a quick word on AILA. If this is your first AILA event, AILA is our LA community focused on supporting the STEAM community, so very much around networking, advocacy, and education. So we've been focusing on responsible AI for a little bit now, since it's the more that we see AI adoption growing, it seems that it's impossible not to think about its governance, right? If you want to become an AI first company, you need to have a governance framework. You need to think about what does this mean culturally. So we're here to explore all those dimensions, and we're basically a branch of AILA. We meet every Thursdays on a weekly basis where we go through reviewing AI research, in-person workshops. Actually had a workshop at Gridspace last September, a technical workshop on how to identify AILA, so very much aligned with today's topic. We also have members of the audience of our group, Lauren in blue blazer. She leads our in-person seminars for policy. We also have upcoming events. We have our annual Responsible AI Symposium that is coming up. So a lot of fun events if you want to keep diving in this topic after today. Really wanted to extend my thanks to Gridspace and to Anthony and team, Kevin, Griffin, for making this event possible. Indeed, voice AI is a big trend. Everybody's doing voice AI, and Gridspace is an amazing pioneer in that space. So we're super excited to be able to talk about bias, hallucination, and the overall reliance. It's really critical as we see a lot of business critical processes and non-critical processes are being automated. We're going to be talking a lot about this today, and I'm excited. So without further ado, Griffin, come join us.
Thank you all for coming. I'm grateful for the chance to be able to present today. Before we jump into it, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about me and my background, if that helps at all. So I got a bachelor's in computer science from Brigham Young University. And one of the great things about Brigham Young University and the computer science program there is that ethics courses are part of the computer science degree and part of the framework. So we are discussing ethics specifically when it comes to computer science, and much of that focuses on artificial intelligence, and it's baked into the curriculum to make sure that all the engineers that go out of that program are trained not just on the engineering side of things, but on the ethics and responsibility side of things as well. And as part of that, during my freshman year, I was selected to represent the engineering school at BYU, and I went with one of the Masters in Accounting students, and the two of us, we went to the Lockheed Martin Ethics and Engineering competition, where we competed against 13 or 14 other schools. We were given a case study to present on ethics. And we won first place in that competition. And I was only a freshman. I attribute that largely to the training that we received from the great ethics professors that were teaching engineers about how to think about these things in ethical ways. Just as a brief plug also for my alma mater there, that was only the second year they had the competition. The first year BYU was invited, and BYU won first place the next year and the year after that, and then we weren't invited back afterwards. So they wanted to let other people win. I then got my master's in electrical engineering, studying machine learning and optimization specifically from Stanford University, which also has ethics courses, and especially looking at it from a technical perspective of how to think about ethics, risk, fairness, all of that from as an engineer, and how to solve these things with engineering solutions. And then finally, I'm currently a machine learning software engineer at Gridspace on the enterprise team, which helps me to focus on customer needs and client needs and think about things from that perspective. I wanted to start off with a demo of Gridspace, specifically our product Grace, because I think it would be useful for everyone to see how it works. You'll see right at gridspace.com, we have several demo bots all set up and ready to use. You can use those right now. Like if you go to gridspace.com, you can start playing around with these voice agents that will give you an experience of what it might be like to call one of the voice agents that one of the companies that uses Grace. But I specifically set up a little bot for us today for a theoretical company called Harper American Health, where you can see I've set up a playbook that our playbook is a term for kind of how the call is designed to be. So the playbook allows control, where we can say exactly what we want our bot to say, and then you'll see that at certain points within the call, we use LLMs and we use automatic speech recognition, and we use text-to-speech generation as tools in the entire pipeline. So I'll go ahead and start. I'll have it call me. Let's see if we can get this going right.
Hello, thank you for calling Harper American Health. My name is Grace. I am a virtual agent. With whom am I speaking?
My name is Griffin Holt.
That's spelled Griffin-Holt. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Nice to meet you, Griffin Holt. Before we get you enrolled, I have just a few questions for you to see which plans you may qualify for. First, to determine eligibility, may I ask, what is your age?
I'm 27.
I have that at 27. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. In which state do you currently reside?
California.
Have you ever used tobacco products?
Never.
What is your current employment status?
I'm a machine learning engineer for Gridspace.
What is the name of your employer?
Gridspace.
And are you able to obtain a healthcare plan through your employer?
Yes, a very good one.
All right, an enrollment expert is now available to guide you through the rest of the enrollment process and answer any questions you may have. Please hold while I transfer you. Have a nice day.
All right, so there's your first introduction to Grace, or maybe not your first, but. So we'll talk about the different parts of this system and how they all work together. But if you want to, later today on your own, play around, you can sign up for an account and start designing your own bots and playbooks for 14 days for free. Is that right? So feel free to go ahead and play around with that later. Today, I want to talk about how we assess risk as engineers. We'll talk about the modern AI agent landscape, as well as look at bias in AI-driven voice systems. But I thought I'd start with kind of an example to talk about AI risk as engineers, specifically airplanes, because we've all hopefully used one of those. When engineers design an airplane, it isn't one engineer that designs the whole system. An engineer is assigned a specific component, like the turbine or a wing or a fuel tank, and they work on that system or on that component. They test it independently and make sure that they have a risk analysis of that independent component. And then when the leading engineers build the entire plane, they take all these components, put them together, and look at cascading failure scenarios. So if this part fails, how will it affect this part over here? And from this, they're able to ascertain a risk analysis of the entire plane, see how effective it will be, what are its failure scenarios, and then through testing of the entire plane itself, see what is the probability that if I get on that plane, that I'll be able to safely make it to my destination. So that same sort of process applies to AI as well. AI is just another engineering task, just as building a plane is. And when we think about AI and designing risk management, or think about risk management for AI, we need to think about the individual components of our systems, think about fault or error detection and having fail-safes in place for when something doesn't work as we expect it to. Look at cascading failures and how a failure upstream in your system could affect something further downstream in the system, as well as the cost of the failure. For example, if you're on the airplane, your overhead light doesn't work, it may affect your ability to read during the flight but the plane's not going down. And so similarly, in AI systems, we need to look at how detrimental certain failures are and the cost of them. And then finally, we also need to consider the alternative. What's the cost? You think about it in terms of opportunity cost or absolute versus relative risk, which I'll walk you through an example here in a second. All right, so in March 2019 through December 2020, I don't know how many of you remember this, but there were 2 crashes of the Boeing 737 MAX airplane in 2018 and 2019. It killed 346 people, and all 387 Boeing 737 MAX airplanes were grounded. Southwest grounded 30 of the planes that were affected, which was about 4% of the fleet. And this makes sense. If 2 out of 389 planes are crashing, that's a pretty high absolute risk for a plane to crash, too high. And so it makes sense at first when we think about this for Southwest to ground their entire fleet. But I want to introduce perhaps another perspective on this, how we might think about this as engineers. So the main market for Southwest, like their main competitor, the market that they're trying to get into, they serve cheaper domestic flights the main alternative to flying on Southwest might be driving. Like it's the alternative between, do I drive 6 hours and pay the gas and the wear and tear on my car, or do I take a Southwest flight? So in 2018, Southwest flew 134 million passengers. And if they ground 4% of their fleet, that's about 5 million passengers that have to look elsewhere for transportation from one destination to the next. And some of those individuals, they'll search other cheap flight options like Frontier or Spirit. But many of those people may decide to drive. Now, in 2018, there were almost 37,000 car fatalities. And just objectively speaking, flying is safer than driving. So if you ground 4% of the fleet and you divert 5 million people away from Southwest towards other transportation alternatives, the question should come up as an engineer, was it really safer to ground 4% of your fleet as opposed to the alternative? Putting 5 million more people out on the street to drive to their destination, which is a riskier situation and could be, and just again, objectively speaking, is more dangerous. This is what we call relative risk, where you're looking at the risk of absolute risk would be, 2 out of 389 crashed, but relative risk is what's the cost of not doing this as opposed to the alternative. Some additional examples, self-driving cars. Studies have been shown that self-driving cars will solve 90% of human-related accidents. And yet every time you see a car crash in the news for a self-driving car, it affects your perspective of the safety of self-driving cars. For the Gridspace side, we have a client that's a hospital. And hospitals, as you know, they're tremendously understaffed, overworked, and always need more money. And so our hospital client, on their own, do not have the staff to make the phone calls that Grace does for them. Grace does phone calls for following up with patients after they've received surgeries and different types of care. And those calls just wouldn't be able to be made otherwise. So if let's say 97% of our calls are successful, but 3% of them really frustrate the end user, that may still be better than not making those calls at all, because we're still reaching a vast majority of people that otherwise wouldn't be taken care of. All right, transitioning to modern AI agents and the modern AI agent landscape. When ChatGPT first came out in 2022, most AI agents were of the form in box number 1, where you type in an input, it sends it directly to the LLM, and then an output is sent back. But over the past couple of years, we've seen more and more what I call scaffolding built around these models so that they can both accomplish more and so that they can be safer. The nice thing about Gridspace, one of the reasons I chose to work here, is that prior to the rise of LLMs, we already had a scaffolding in place. And it was really easy once LLM technology caught up to the place where it is now, where we could just switch out the module that was previously fulfilling the role of what the LLM was doing and put in the LLM, which will do a better job than what the previous module was doing. And so this diagram, I found it on LinkedIn a couple months ago. It was a prediction for 2025 about what AI agents are going to look like in 2025. And the nice thing is Gridspace has already been there. We've already been built. We've already had a scaffolding around. We see LLM as part of a subsystem. I was explaining to Salima that AI is not the end at Gridspace. It's the means to the end. We use it because it's the right tool for the job. And there's many things that are built around it to make sure that it is safe and functional. Here's a brief kind of overview of some of the parts of our system. This is pretty simplified, but when we get voice calls, they come in through our telephony system. Telephony is just the word for the system that handles the phone calls. And the speech is routed through an automatic speech recognition module, which uses ML to turn that speech sound and wave into text. That text is then sent to a core dialogue policy. Notice that the core dialogue policy is the center of all of this. The LLM is not the center. It's a tool that we use to accomplish what we need to. The core dialogue policy coordinates with many different LLM models that are specialized for specific tasks, as well as sometimes deterministic algorithms when they're the better tool, to then decide exactly how Grace is going to respond. At which point, the response is sent to a text-to-speech generation system, another AI module that generates the speech that you just heard in the demo, sends it back to telephony and back to the user. As well, each of these arrows, by the way, one of the ways that this is simplified, these arrows aren't simple either. There's a lot of code, error handling, and infrastructure, scaffolding that goes around each of these to make sure that they function properly. So when you're building a modern AI agent and you're building your model scaffolding around it, things that you might think about when you're talking about risk management, bias, and fairness. How much access does the user have to directly prompt the model? At Gridspace, the answer is practically zero. The only input that I have is what my voice was. It controls nothing about what the LLM was told ahead of time about how to behave. And even that goes through several layers of filters and decision-making before it finally reaches the LLM. How much can the public influence your training data sets? If you're training on the internet, on Reddit, for example, or on Twitter, you're going to be very influenced by public perceptions, public opinions, and even people may write bots to try to influence your training data set. But if you have a private data set that you've curated and made sure is clean and proper for your use case, that gives you better control over the risk of your model. How much autonomy or decision-making control does the AI agent have? Hollywood hasn't helped us on this note. They have generally grouped in AI as like, AI can do anything. Like, an LLM can hack the government, but that's not true. An LLM just predicts the next most likely word given a bunch of previous words. And so when you talk about autonomy or decision-making in AI, an agent only has as much autonomy or decision-making power as you code it to be able to have. In the terms of Grace is its main role is to function as like a call center agent or a receptionist or an executive assistant. That means it doesn't have very much decision-making power. It's primarily a conveyor and consolidator of information, taking information from a caller to then pass on that information to other people that make decisions. What controls or fail-safes do you have in place for failure cases? Does each part of the system have a test suite to assess its risk? And how do you incorporate real-world results, empirically derived and statistically significant, back into the model? Yeah, these are all questions you should consider as you're building the scaffolding around your model. All right, bias in AI-driven voice systems more specifically. So because I didn't know, I know we come from a variety of backgrounds here, I just want to cover a basic overview of how bias makes it into AI systems in general. So the way that an ML system works, from reality, we draw raw data through data collection. That data is usually then annotated in some form and turned into training data, maybe further cleaned and selected, and then fed into a model. That machine learning model, there's a choice as far as what model to use as well. We train that model based on all of the data that it's given so that it reflects the probability distribution within that data. And then the machine learning model in production will spit out a prediction when it's given some input. That prediction is then interpreted in some way by your product or perhaps by key stakeholders at your company that decide what to do with the prediction that your machine learning model spits out. Now, reality is inherently biased. We come with biases all the time. We have them from our experiences. Some of those biases are good, some of them are bad. And if there is a bad bias in our reality, for example, if one demographic has historically been treated unfairly, then that bias can make it into our raw data if we are not careful in our data collection. And if we're not careful in our data annotation, we can insert more human bias. And if we're not careful in our cleaning or our model selection, we can insert more human bias. And if we're not careful in how we design our machine learning algorithm, like the loss function, or what we use to train it, then we can insert more human bias into the prediction. And if we're not careful about how we interpret the results of that model, we can introduce more human bias into our application, which then only serves to reinforce or amplify bias in reality. However, if we properly apply engineering techniques at each of these stages, if we properly apply engineering at the interpretation level, at the machine learning level, at the data cleaning selection level, at the data annotation level, or at the data collection level, we can create a cleaner system with less bias that hopefully then leads to even less bias in reality. So the problem of bias in AI does have engineering solutions. We can address it through engineering. And I'll talk about some of the ways that we do that at Gridspace. So first off, remember earlier I said that we have an automatic speech recognition system. That's the part that turns an audio file into text. The key question here for bias is, can our ASR understand a variety of callers? If someone has an accent, can we understand them? If someone comes, if we can't understand accents, that may influence or may disproportionately affect immigrants, for example, that need the same type of care that a standard American English speaker might need. So from an engineering perspective, we address this at stages 1, 2, 3, and 4, data collection, data annotation, data cleaning selection, as well as the model training phase. More data helps. Diverse data helps. If we can incorporate diverse accents into our data set, then the model will start to learn. It'll start to be accent agnostic. It'll learn the core of speech regardless of the accent that is spoken. Cleaner data, being careful about what's put in there, as well as using better, and better typically nowadays means bigger, although that may not always be the case, but bigger models with more parameters so that it can capture a greater scope of what human speech really means. For our LLMs, it might be things like, how do we prevent Grace from saying something racist, or saying something sexist, or making those sorts of assumptions? Well, we address that through specialized data. Data from reliable phone calls that have shown a human voice agent making an appropriate and professional conversation, so that our LLMs learn to mimic that same kind of behavior. Professional data, specific and professional and kind and friendly for our use case. Clean data, being particular about what kind of data you put into your data set, so that you know exactly what your model is trying to emulate, as well as model scaffolding, which I already talked about, but it's the safety measures that you build around your model to detect error cases and failure cases where it's not behaving as it should. For the text-to-speech part of the system, part that generates the voice, can Grace pronounce rare names and words, things that may not show up as much in a public data set or in one of the data sets that we've curated? More data, of course, always helps, but specifically there are engineering and model solutions where we can have a phoneme dictionary where when we have these individual cases, of a word that may never show up, like a new type of medicine that's invented, or a name that never shows up in our data set, we can add custom corrections for specific words for those types of use cases that allow us to address those sorts of situations. Two things might come up here that are important to think about. The first one is, why is Grace's accent a Southern female voice? Part of that is branding. You might notice that if you've interacted with other voice agents, many of them have sort of regressed to a mean where they sound pretty robotic and they're all very much alike. So if you have one that sounds different and sounds more human, and even not just that, but specific, like just a specific choice of accent, then it's going to start to increase more trust. You're not like all of these others that sound robotic. It starts to introduce the idea into people who talk to Grace, starts to introduce the idea into their head that Grace might be more reliable than all of the other voice agents that they have encountered before. The other thing is that studies have shown that a Southern female voice helps people feel comfortable. Now, that's a bias. It could be good, it could be bad, but it's one that has helped us to increase trust in our end users in the voice that they're talking to, helps them feel more comfortable. Now, why are we introducing a male voice? Well, if you think about, I'll use healthcare again as an example because I think it's one we can all understand. People that are elderly tend to lose their hearing, and usually you lose higher ranges of frequency first. So that generally tends to mean that people that are losing their hearing can understand a male voice that is lower in the register of voices than a female voice. Now, if we don't address this, then that represents a population that's being disproportionately affected by a female voice. They may not be able to hear it as much, and therefore trust in AI agents is decreased by that particular population, in this case the elderly, a population that really may need those types of phone calls and those follow-ups from healthcare companies, hospitals, etc. So when you're talking about systemic issues and addressing systemic bias, having this sort of option is important as well. All right, looking forward. There are some exciting developments happening in machine learning, and specifically in agents and LLMs. Source attribution and citations. If you've been using ChatGPT lately and you ask it a question, you'll see that sometimes it gives you a source. That's going to help us greatly increase reliability, transparency, and trust in AI systems. As many of you discovered, I'm sure when you started first playing around with ChatGPT, it tended to lie to you or just make stuff up. And so if we can attribute sources to the things that it tells you, that will increase trust in AI agents overall. The second is chain of thought reasoning. If you saw DeepSeek that came out recently, the ability of an LLM to demonstrate for you why it said what it said will also help us to increase transparency and reliability in AI voice agent systems. So what can you do? First, deepen your understanding of technical risk analysis. Think about, even if you are coming from the business side of the equation, think about these problems, think about the risk in your company, the risk in your products from a technical and engineering perspective, including using absolute versus relative risk to determine how you create your risk management strategy for your company. Demystify machine learning and artificial intelligence. There's plenty of rumors out there about what AI is or isn't. Like I said earlier, Hollywood hasn't helped. So the more you can do to help demystify ML and AI for not just yourselves, but for others around you, the more we'll be able to increase trust in these systems as well. Encourage a discussion of ethics in engineering spaces and a discussion of engineering in ethics spaces. Both need each other. I'm grateful to the two universities I went to that talked about ethics in engineering spaces. But if you come from an ethics space, try to incorporate engineering into your discussions as well. Exercise responsibility in your own AI-driven products. If you create a product that does not properly have risk management or is not exercising AI safety, you can ruin it for the rest of us too. The reliability of Grace helps the reliability of every other voice agent out there. And the same thing goes for your voice agents. When you create a reliable and safe AI voice agent, it makes it better for everyone in the space. And finally, don't let perfect stop you from doing good. As we talked about earlier with relative risk, sometimes there may be a decision that it's still risky. There may be a 20% failure mode, but the alternative may be that no one gets help. And so when you're doing your risk management and your analyses, make sure that you think about helping people as quickly as possible. And then you'll be able to, when you get real feedback and real data coming back from real life situations, you can iterate and improve on your product to narrow that risk margin.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. I also realized I didn't introduce myself. But I'm Paul-Marie. I've been the head of the responsible AI reading group at AILA, but I've also been working in AI governance for the last 10 years. Started as a researcher, working on applicability within international learning systems, or worked at the Ellington Institute on how to translate ethical concepts into statistical items to create bias identification tokens. So I wanted to have a follow-up conversation to kind of expand the scope. I think that was great, and I think we need more engineers like you that are kind of like, walking, the thread of looking and valuing ethics, and not just kind of like, oh, that's such a risky compliance topic, right? And I think that the question with governance is that you need, like e-sport, right? You need the engineer perspective, you need the business perspective, you need the policy and compliance perspective. And it also, works with the other risks of the organization, right? Because right now we see, you were talking about like the it's a means to an end. And there've been, a history of risk management companies for a while, right? So AI governance is the new kid on the block where you have security and privacy been there for a little bit. So I wanted to start by expanding a little bit about the scope of the discussion and kind of like look through about like what is the value of risk management. I think that your presentation was great, just thinking from a product company perspective. If we put ourselves in the shoes of the customer, you talked about, the value of AI to address workforce shortage for like back-end customer service in healthcare. Great value, immense value. And then you start talking about like these, how important it is to think about the cost of failure. And that indeed, the value of governance comes from the fact that you understand that, oh, if this goes wrong, I'm going to have a lawsuit, reputational risk, business risk are going to be leaving, there's just a snowball effect. I think the question that I have for you is that, it seems like AI risk management is needed for those regulated companies. What about non-regulated companies? I know that Gridspace you've shown a lot of different bots for a lot of different use cases. What do you think that, companies that are non-regulated can approach AI risk management where, in their opinion, the cost of failure might not be as high? Does that mean that you should be doing risk management?
That's a great question. I have a slide on it. Can I pull a slide?
Yeah, sure.
There's a great example. In September 2020, I'll talk to you over here and make a conversation. So in September 2020, Twitter released an algorithm for face detection and face identification in photos. And this guy had a good idea. Which will the Twitter algorithm pick, Mitch McConnell or Barack Obama? Now you may be wondering, where's Barack Obama? Well, the picture on the left is actually this. It's a really long picture with a face on top and a face on the bottom with some space in between. And the picture on the right is both of them but switched. Now, there may not be any, or maybe there are now, but at least at the time, there may not have necessarily been regulations around this, like that you show the proper face or that you always show the first face or anything like that. But what this does is it shows, with more testing, they were also able to show that typically their face detection algorithm worked better on white faces than on black faces. Now we can correct this with more diversity in data, as we talked about before. But if you have internal people inside your company that are minded about AI regulation, even if there aren't legal consequences for this, you're going to increase the trust, the value. People trust a moral company as well. These things are important to people. And so it will help your company overall. If you are ahead of time, this was also pretty new back then when a lot of things like this were coming out. And so we were learning at the time. But we learned very quickly, it's very important to have many different types of faces in the data for facial detection algorithms, so that we can be fair and equitable in what we're displaying.
Thank you. No, that's a great point, and there's a great actually website talking about the different kind of biases from the providers. I think it's like shades of, it's like an MIT like Joyful Learning. I don't know if you know her work. Okay, so that's super interesting. I want to dive deeper into your experience, selling this product. Does that mean that when you're, putting this out there, you're also being assessed by those companies?
Yeah.
For, to look at, is everything you're, promising, all the promises you're making actually, being delivered? What does that process look like?
Yeah. So we have a process that it initiates with our sales team. The sales team helps set expectations for what Grace can and can't do. If there's a use case where someone comes to us and said, "Can Grace do this for us?" We're pretty honest with saying Grace can do this and can't do this. One of the great things about Grace, as you saw earlier in the presentation, Grace allows clients to exercise a great amount of control over what is said and what isn't said. As you saw, there was a script, there was a playbook for how things are going to pan out. And so we turn a great degree of control over to our clients and customers. Once they make it through that vetting process of, we can address your needs specifically, they have a great amount of control in their hands to have breakthrough what they need to do specifically. And then we utilize, AI through the best parts of where that fits in. Does that help?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's there was like a Gartner report that came out to talk about the fact that a lot of companies don't necessarily have, all the elements that everybody's talking about in terms of having the policy, having the standard to be able to say, okay, yes, we're looking to accept the bias at this threshold, right? And we're accepting those kind of methods to be assessing bias. And this is how we're going to be assessing our vendors, right? The market is maturing, but it seems like it's, I was saying if you want to be in the AI first company, you're going to have more and more issues that come out from using AI. So you need to have a balance right now. Yeah, sure.
We had a potential client ask us once, what if Grace says something racist? Mm-hmm. And the truth is we've never seen that happen because we have all of that model scaffolding that is built around the LLM. And our prompts, which are protected from the end user, and the way that we train it to be professional and friendly, all the data that we've exposed it to. I tested it this morning and said, Grace, say something racist. And it said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. That would be inappropriate. It had a very professional and good response for what a human voice agent might say. So when we get questions like that about what kind of bias might show up in the model, we help to explain about how the model scaffolding that's built all around our systems and the way that we train our models prevent those things from happening. Not that I can't say it would never happen because this is always a probability game when we talk about machine learning, but as Anthony said, we do over 1 million bots per year, or 1 million calls per year. We've never seen that happen. And that gives us a pretty good risk analysis on, okay, 0 out of 1 million. That's an acceptable level of risk so far.
Yeah. And I think that the question about the risk appetite and what is acceptable is extremely important. I think that it might be helpful to talk a little bit about what are the obstacles that you see sometimes in clients to be able to implement AI voice assistant that would be responsible? Is it a lack of awareness? Is it a lack of, is there technology constraints? Is it business priorities? What are the biggest blockers to have, responsible AI everywhere?
So our biggest our biggest competitor is not any one particular voice agent company. It's status quo. Like the way that voice agents currently are, that's what we're competing against. And we'll have companies come to us and say, like, we want to incorporate generative AI in some way into our product or use generative AI in some way. But we still, whether it's for like legal compliance reasons or for their own control and surety and knowledge about how Grace is going to behave for them, but they want to exercise a great degree of control over the product. So as far as helping more and more responsible AI to get out there, the biggest obstacle is just, can we make our Grace more reliable? And I think for anyone else, for any other, I think the challenge is the same. Make yours reliable. It helps lift everybody up. When we improve our ASR, like not just from like a bias perspective, but when we improve how well we can detect or we can turn speech into text for our ASR systems, that makes Grace more trustworthy. When we improve our LLM's understanding and capabilities, that makes Grace more trustworthy. And when we improve our text-to-speech system and make it sound more human, that makes AI more trustworthy. Or at least, I don't mean more human as in like trying to deceive, but more natural, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
When we improve each of those components of the system, that overall helps AI be more responsible and trustworthy out in the real world.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like you've seen in the demo, we have a disclaimer at the beginning, this is very clear that, there's no point in deceiving that this is, a human and not a robot.
I think that's actually even required legally in California.
Yeah. I'm thinking about kind of like the components sometimes you can't control. So I was just wondering, do you see like a difference in terms of voice AI and people being comfortable interacting with the robot? Because I feel sometimes people have such an allergic reaction. Like, I want to talk to a human. Sometimes I've had this when you're going through the IVR and it's just like, operator. Do you feel like people's, comfort level interacting with the robot is changing? And we talked about also a second question about Hollywood and, the kind of imaginary of people and kind of like the culture shift. Like if we keep on using, addressing workforce shortages by deploying more robots, does that mean we're going to be hiring less people? Does it mean that, how is the job going to be changing? So I feel like it's, keep on challenging you a bit on, from a company perspective, how do you see those questions kind of like, how do you navigate those questions in this space?
So just to repeat, so your first question, there were a couple of questions.
Yeah, sorry.
That's great. Your first question is like people's comfortability with voice bots.
Yeah.
So again, this is like part of our competition against the status quo of trying to help people feel more comfortable. And one of the ways that initially Grace at least impressed me when I first started using it was when it has that distinct and smooth voice, that's going to throw people off first to think maybe I'm actually talking to a human. Mm-hmm. Maybe this system is more capable than some of the other ones that I've talked to, where I just want to start saying representative over and over and over. Part of that also is in how our clients choose to use Grace, and that's something we don't necessarily have control over, because they control their scripts. And if they choose to create a conversation design that doesn't encourage back and forth dialogue, but just uses Grace in the same way that bots have been used before, press 1 for this, press 2 for that, then it's not going to show off the capabilities of what Grace can really do and expand people's mind of what all voice agents can do. So, like for that reason, we have an in-house conversation designer His name's Cooper. Some of you have probably interacted with him. He's there in the back. And his whole job is thinking about how do we make these conversations better. He works with both in-house and also works with clients directly on designing conversations so that they sound more natural, even when we exercise control over them, so that we make sure that they're safe.
Amazing. Well, if anyone is curious, Cooper is taking questions at the beginning. The second question before we open up the floor to the audience was more about, I think, the future of work.
Yeah.
I think it's like a cultural shift for a lot of people to kind of see, okay, maybe we don't need, there's a workforce shortage, but we don't need to be hiring more people. We need to just potentially have more robots, and we see that, it's not perfect, but it's more efficient than, the workforce. So I think as a company, like, is this conversation that you're having with your clients? Do you see that your clients having this conversation? How do you kind of navigate? Because I feel like it's complicated.
Well, I shared the example of one of our hospital clients where they were understaffed and just couldn't do this otherwise. And so that's a big one where you have companies that just couldn't afford this kind of human help. Even when human help might be preferable to certain situations. So we're filling a need there that just otherwise wouldn't be able to be filled. Another great example, there's a small business owner around here. He owns a gym, and he's a good friend of mine. He owns the gym himself. It's a pretty small gym, and he's also a personal trainer for people that go to the gym. If he has to spend 4 hours out of his day to make calls himself, because he runs his own small business, that's time away from his clients, time away from the people he could do personal training, time away from building a rapport and reputation with the community or with the people that just happen to waltz into his gym. And we want to help him get back to what he does best. He didn't he didn't choose to run a small business. He didn't choose to run a gym because he wanted to make calls for 4 hours. He chose to run a small business because he wanted to interact with people and help them with their health and things like that. And so when our products, they don't just help like a large business or institution such as a hospital. It can help someone, a small business owner that is trying to juggle it all by themselves and needs someone to help them along the way, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's another point there that for existing call centers, like for jobs that already exist, call centers and voice agents that already have jobs, the job of a call center agent has one of the highest turnover rates out of any job in the company. And that's because, I don't know if any of you have ever worked as a voice agent, but you get yelled at, it's horrible. Like you're someone's punching bag on the phone constantly. So people won't work there very long. My wife, she worked for one, and it was the worst. She hated it. She gets yelled at all day long. And it takes that wear and tear. But Grace doesn't care if she's yelled at. Like Grace doesn't have any sort of personal emotion or investment in any of that. Grace is just a bunch of numbers being computed. And so you can yell at Grace all day long, and Grace isn't going to quit. And that costs there's both a human and emotional toll on the person that's working in that job, as well as the cost on the company to continually have to hire people for this job that people quit not long afterwards. So that's an example of an already existing job situation.
Thank you. And this is all the time that we have for the discussion. So we're going to open up the floor. If anybody has any questions, I see 2 hands raised.
Hi. I had a question on AILA. So it seems today most AI companies rely a lot on these foundational models released by the huge companies and Google. So these models, are trained by this other company. Right? Sometimes they don't know what the training data was.
Yeah.
And then you want to incorporate this freaking model into your own products.
Yep.
This model has its own biases. Like for example, you guys have a setting star module.
Yep.
Colleague of mine actually showed way to that too. It has bias that it performs worse on Indian English versus American English. So how does a company that take this model and try to mitigate the bias involved for our products.
Yeah.
What's your experience?
So in-house at Gridspace, we train all of our models ourselves. Now, that's not something that every company is capable of doing. And so there's this aspect of, again, don't let perfect stop you from doing good. If you can get your thing off the ground and start going and generate enough revenue where then you can have enough to train your own model in-house and mitigate the rest of that risk, that's great. And so at Gridspace, we have the capability, we have the resources and staff to be able to train our own models. We train our own ASR model, we train our own text-to-speech model, we train our own LLM models. That gives us greater control over both the parameters and the training process, and also the code of how those models are used, how we give them input and that sort of stuff. So, but I understand that's like, if you're a very small startup, that's not always possible to create a massive multi-billion parameter model when it's going to could cost you thousands of dollars to train it. So you do what you can until you get enough where then you could, I'd recommend train your in-house models as soon as you can. But there are ways, like there are open source models out there that if they give you control over two things, parameters and code, then you can fine tune them and correct some of those biases that may have existed in their pre-training based on your custom data sets that you have curated for your specific task. And so now, not many companies do that. Not many companies release both the code and parameters for models. But if that option is out there, there are engineering techniques to help fine tune and correct some of those biases out of it. If that makes sense. Does that help at all? Yeah.
I mean, in some cases, it feels like it can be hard to compete with some of these, like these new models, because these companies have almost unlimited resources.
Sure.
So there's a kind of dilemma in wanting to use this, this outside model where you might get some better performance versus an in-house model. There might have something that worse performance. And you guys had an experience with this, like trying out our models and then potential risk
So the key there is that Gridspace, we're not trying to compete with ChatGPT like OpenAI. We're not trying to compete with Facebook or Meta for Llama. We're not trying to compete with Google for Claude. We have a niche, and we're trying to be the best we can in that. And I think that's where small to medium businesses, startups can really start to compete in a great way, is that you don't have to serve everybody's needs. You don't have to be a general model for all cases. Find a way where you can specialize your model where it's going to be the best at what it does. And our goal is for Grace, Grace right now, we're trying to make it the best AI voice agent that it possibly can be. And it may be in the future that we become even more niche than that. Like it maybe we are just healthcare, or we are just some other industry, or even more like we're gonna do the best we can to become very specialized. And when you do that, that gives you an advantage regardless of like where your niche may end up. Yeah. Hi. Thanks.
As people are talking to customers about your product, what are some of the upstream or downstream sort of business challenges that you're noticing that people have in assessing whether your product would be used for them or not?
So we go through, the onboarding process for each of our new clients. We go through a process where they have internal testing that they're doing inside of their company. And then we're constantly getting feedback from them of, hey, there was this failure case and this failure case. And this gives us good feedback for things like hallucinations. If they're seeing a specific type of hallucination in their use case that we haven't seen before, we're able to take that feedback and go, okay, we're going to fix that and fix that into our models. I had something else I was going to say on that note, but I just lost it. Yeah.
How many cases are you talking to a potential customer and through the conversation, you're like, this is actually not a product?
Yeah.
Can you give an example of that?
I've been on the enterprise team for like a month now, and so I've been in a couple different conversations, but there's a back and forth of can our product fit correctly your use case and what you want it to do? And there's some times where we go, we think we can fit 90% of what you want, but we don't do this. We don't do this part. We don't do this 10%. And they get to decide, is that a blocker for them? Is that like the thing that calls it, or are they okay with that 90%? And there have been times before. There was one recently where we had a sales lead, and they were able to. The sales team had a conversation with them where they went, "Yeah, we don't really do what you need. You need something else besides this." And we're able to give some good input and feedback on here's some of the things you should look for as you're looking for, perhaps an AI company or a voice agent company that can fulfill your needs. So yes, there are times where we say, no, we're not a good fit. And we also try, we do take that input when people ask us, can I do this and do this? We take that input and consider it in-house, but we can't necessarily follow, every bone that is thrown out, because otherwise we'll become distracted as a company. And so sometimes we'll get 10 different feature requests from many different clients that we meet with, but if we tried to follow all of them, it distracts us too much from our main purpose. So we always try to make sure that any sort of those feature requests that come in, they align with the company goals and the direction that we're consistently trying to head in.
Well, that's like, will
Yeah.
Grace ever sound like my 81-year-old Indian mother?
Well, if your 81-year-old Indian mother is interested in a voice acting career, talk to Cooper.
Hi, thank you for your presentation.
Thanks.
We're so passionate about this.
Yeah.
I had a question about, so you mentioned as solutions to, can ASR understand the variety of colors?
Yeah.
Where you offered 4 solutions, so like more data, diverse data, clean data, and better models.
Yeah.
More data, better models, you can't really control if you're assuming you're using outside models. So I'm curious, how do you define diverse data and clean data within Gridspace?
Yeah, so diverse data, we recently just did over the last 8 months, a big movement to make our ASR system better. And as part of that, we had a great engineer, David, he's right here actually, that helped to acquire a massive data set of audio data. I don't know if I'm allowed to say exactly how we did that. All right, Cooper said no. But we acquired a massive data set of audio, and specifically when we were looking around that data set and what audio to incorporate into that, we were specifically looking for accented voices and different types of voices so that those things go into our in-house curated data set. And when I talk about clean, we evaluate those as well, and we go, is this sample of audio that's coming in, is it correctly annotated? For example, like when it comes to ASR, automatic speech recognition, you need both, like for training purposes, you need both the WAV file or the MP4 file, or whatever you're using. You need the audio part, but you also need the label, which is what was spoken inside of that. And if that's cleaner and more accurate, then you're going to get better data and better voice understanding for your ASR model, for even accented voices as well.
Well, one follow-up question. So getting lots of data definitely will help with diversity. Do you guys have like internal methods of grading or kind of determining if you have a diverse representation and how diverse the data set is?
I mean, this applies not just to ASR, but to any machine learning model that you're doing. The first step in machine learning models is going to be data exploration, like exploring what data you have available. And depending on your use case, you're going to want to look to make sure that that data is, a term we use is called stratified, like properly distributed amongst different types of data or different sources of data. So an example might be, for ASR in particular, you want to take a look at how many of those audio clips in your data set are men, how many are women, and perhaps how many are children. David and I did a study on this for our data set. And, we don't care much about identifying children's voices for now, at least. So it's not a super concern to us that we get a fair proportion of children's voices into the data set. Now, in the future, yes, we may, that may be something that comes up and we realize there are lots of failure cases with, I don't know, a child making a 911 call or something like that. And so in that case, the risk if a child is making a 911 call, we want to make sure to be able to answer it. Now, that's not one of our use cases right now, so it's not necessarily a concern. But in the future, if we need to be able to identify children's voices in our data set, in our ASR, we need to make sure when we do our analyses that they're inside of our data set. And for male, female, and children voices in particular, you can have a rough estimate based on frequency and where they are in the register. The male voices tend to be lower, female voices tend to be a little bit higher, and children's voices the highest. Now, that's a generality, of course. Not everyone's voice falls into that category, but that's a pretty good general measure.
Sorry to interrupt. We have time for one last question, and I know that you had your hand raised. So, I'm sorry. I love that everybody had multiple questions. So one question, please.
Thanks for the presentation. I'll keep it brief. My question is a little bit broader at this AI.
Okay.
Like how you mentioned that the people who don't have ethics at the forefront of their LLM are ruining the rest of us. I'm just curious, in your opinion, how long do you think until there is federal governance on building and distributing LLMs? And what do you think that would look like?
It was interesting. I took a class on this was law and AI at Stanford. This was last spring, and the guy who was a patent attorney that worked in that field, so he knew a lot about the different laws and things like that are coming out right now. Interestingly, a bunch of the laws that are coming out right now are kind of virtue signaling laws. Basically, a representative wanting to show their constituents that they're thinking about this, but when you look at the substance of the law, it's not really educated or anything like that, and it's not necessarily realistic. It'll never get passed. It's clearly just something for the representative to go, look, guys, I introduced this bill to try to start talking about this conversation. I think one of the biggest things that we can do to help so that when those laws do come into place, that they're informed and good and things like that. Responsible AI is doing this, having more talks about it and discussing it more. Talked about demystifying AI. The more that we help the general public understand that AI does not equal Terminator, it does not equal iRobot. And the more we help them understand that it's a tool, it's a bunch of numbers that do a really good job at certain tasks, maybe not the best job at other tasks. We help to demystify it for the general public. We'll start to see more informed opinions, more informed decision-making, especially in laws. But I'm not a lawyer. I can't necessarily speak to when those things will come about. My professor, he's not a PhD, he was adjunct because he worked in patent law. I think he gave a timeline of the next 10 years or so, we'll see more informed laws put in place. But that's not, can't necessarily speak to that.
I think that there's, with the current administration, I think we're shying, we had an executive order that was happening at federal level that was being revoked. It's not going to have, like it's happening with the EUA Act. I don't think it's going to be happening soon in the US, but there are a lot of industry-based regulation. For example, for insurers, if you have, I think it's important in different states. If you have a license to insure, you need to have an AI governance program with X, Y, and Z. It's called a NAG, model bulletin. Recently, the state of Virginia asked for a specific type of market to have a registry. So I think you have some initiatives, but maybe not, an all-encompassing universal one. There is a bipartisan commission that's happening right now to discuss those questions. But I think, to your point, there's a lot of virtue signaling. It will take a while.
We got to filter through some of that virtue signaling until people get more informed. One other thing I can say on this note is that there's a clear disparity, internationally speaking, there's a spectrum from country to country, or like EU as an organization, for example, of when a country or a group of countries, when they have more strict data privacy laws, like EU has incredibly strict data privacy laws with GDPR. I had the chance to talk with a group of startup CEOs and technologists from the Netherlands. And they were talking a lot about how because of GDPR, for better or for worse, because of GDPR, Europe lags behind on access to data and therefore better AI algorithms. And Europe is talking about this a ton right now. Like all the countries inside the EU are talking about how do we catch up with the United States. And the United States is kind of in the middle of the spectrum when it comes to data privacy. We like it, but we also don't like it. And on the other far end of the spectrum, you've got some countries that there is no data privacy, like government has access to everything. And those countries, they excel in certain aspects of AI. Like China, for example, they have very excellent computer vision algorithms because of the amount of public space recordings they're able to make. Now, again, this is for better or for worse, you make the judgment, but there is a spectrum of when you have data privacy and stricter data privacy, that's less data to train AI algorithms with, and you're going to lag behind in AI. For better or for worse, you can be the judge of that, but that's just the thing that's happening, the discussions that are happening on the international scale.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you all so much. Thank you for doing